Hello everyone and welcome to the Giant Brain Lecture Theatre. I'm Ian McAllister and I'll be your interviewer tonight. My guest tonight has had a varied career: poet, writer, podcaster, writing course designer and teacher, tabletop critic and podcaster. I've had a lot of fun doing one of his writing courses, and his podcast, Death of a Thousand Cuts, is a great insight into the world of writers and writing. Having previously written 2 works of fiction in The Honours and The Ice House, my guest has recently turned his attention to the world of non-fiction and the subject of anxiety. His most recent work is called Coward: Why We Get Anxious and What We Can Do About It. To talk about that and his love of the tabletop hobby, I'm delighted to welcome Tim Clare to the Giant Brain HQ. How are you doing, Tim?
I'm really well, Ian. Thank you very much for having me. How are you?
I am good. Yeah, a little hot. Like I've had to close the windows to my study and sitting beside a computer outputting heat, so I may melt to pieces during this interview. But other than that, I'm good. It's very warm. I'm sure it's quite warm with you as well.
Yeah, it's super sweltering. I'm just in that kind of period where we want the evening to draw in slightly. So it's like, you game outside? Like, it's definitely muggy in a way that isn't necessarily conducive in the same way as the winter is to playing games.
Yeah, I was leaving a role-playing session last night about 10:30, and I was like, oh, this is just nice. It was just nice and cool, still light. It's like, this is nice. I could go and play some more games. Great. But I have to sleep instead. So you've recently been to UK Games Expo, Tim. How did that go?
Yeah, I mean, I went to my first ever UK Games Expo, and actually my first ever games convention in 2021. That was my first one. And right. So I really went through a kind of it's only been recently that I've gone to them at all. And then, so 2023 was my third, which has come around really quickly, it feels like. And I don't know, I had a few friends who couldn't make it. And so they were like, can you tell me what it was like? What was it like? And my honest answer was, what do you value more? The quality of honesty or the quality of like protecting the feelings of your friends? Because the truth was I had an amazing time, but I was aware, and I know you didn't go either, but I'm sort of super aware that, it might not have been an intrinsically brilliant event. It might just be I was very lucky to hit all the high notes of it, but I had an amazing time. I think it was my favourite convention experience that I've had so far. As much as I went to Aircon earlier this year, really loved it, really loved the atmosphere there. I think it's a terrific convention.
Yeah, I myself and loved it. Loved Aircon. Yeah, hoping to go back next year.
It's really nice, isn't it? I think like I was in a period of like, I'd had the flu 2 weeks before and I still had like post-viral fatigue. And so I was really just dragging myself through Aircon, as lovely as it was. I was so tired. But I went to UK Games Expo and it was wicked. It was really good. And I bump into people now. Tim, would you like to play a game? I'm like, yes. And so I've gone from being this very, very shy guy, kind of like creeping around the expo, going back to my room early, to just playing loads of games from the moment I got in there, seeing stuff from all these different publishers, and best of them, just meeting people I've never met before and getting to sit there and play games with them. And it was just everything you could ask for in a expo experience, really.
Yeah, I do miss Expo. I didn't go during the sort of like when they came back during the pandemic period, and I'm booked in for hotels next year, so I'll definitely go back next year and can't wait to go. Because you got to, otherwise it gets very expensive very quickly. So yeah, I've already booked in for next year, so hoping to go back. Were there any sort of particular experiences or games that stood out for you?
I mean, like UK Games Expo falls in a very weird point in the publisher's release calendar because it's, there's Gen Con and there's Essen, and it's rare that a publisher thinks, where we want to do our big launch, our big push, we'll do that at UK Games Expo, when you've got those other 2 events sort of sitting athwart it. And I think it suffers for that as being a sort of like big release, big buzz kind of event. But that does mean you can kind of just do your own thing with it and not be pulled, because I found Essen really tiring for that buzz chasing. You've got to go and find this game and play this. Like the relentless march of playtesting really was, I had to playtest to see everything in Essen to get round it.
Yeah,
I had to, from the moment I got there, book stuff and be marching from playtest to playtest. But having said all that, there were a few things that I liked. There was a lot of like small box stuff that I really enjoyed. And I know everyone gets to a point in their board gaming life where they start going, oh, I really feel there's a lot of small box, little box titles that are real boosting quality of those. I think that's probably just to do with space considerations and sometimes getting older and having like limited time.
Yeah.
So it may be that, but I played, Pandasaurus launched a Beacon Patrol. So that was launched at UK Games Expo. And it's for those people who haven't seen it, it's a small box tile laying game that's about, you're just going, you're patrolling the Nordic coast, checking that all the automatic automatic lighthouses are working, checking that the buoys are working. That's it, really. You're not even the game doesn't even pretend you're mapping the coast and the islands. Right. It's already been done. You're just checking that things work. So it sort of seems on the surface it's a co-op game, tile laying, super gentle, it seems. And and I was like, and I read the rule book, it's very small. And I must admit, I was quietly rolled my eyes. I was like, oh, come on. All right then. We've all played Dorf Romantic. I get it. And actually, it's a really surprisingly sort of crunchy little co-op game with the mechanic of swapping tiles feels really good. It feels like you're genuinely cooperative. We really quickly were like, oh, this game's difficult. Like everyone, we were all a bit like, this is a bit patronizing actually. We're gonna breeze through this because the rules are so simple. Yeah. Actually doing well. Because you can only place depending on where your boats are, and you're trying to maximize your score, and you very quickly realize that you've come slightly unglued. You've been too cocky. And it went, I think it's a great sign of the game when we went from sort of scornful, oh, well, let's just poodle around with our boats and do this, to wait, don't do anything for a second. And it feels genuinely cooperative. You can swap tiles with other players, and so it feels dynamic. I like it a lot. I think it's a great title. I tell you what, I played the roll and write of Walking in Burano. I don't know if you've seen the game.
I vaguely know of it, but yeah, I've never played it myself.
It looks beautiful, right? It's a beautiful theme. These kind of like Venetian, that is Venice-ish, isn't it? My sense of geography is poor, but all these canals, beautiful coloured houses, and they've done a roll and write version of it. And it was just really, really up my street. It's beautiful. It's just like a really crunchy roll and write. Again, looks gorgeous, looks cozy, is actually a kind of living hell that slowly gets worse as the game goes on, right? I love
when gentle games reveal themselves to be absolutely mean, horrible things. Like Azul's one of my favorite games. It looks like gentle and nice, and it's just the meanest thing. Azul.
You do the first round of Azul, and you're like, on your first play of it, you're like, well, this is too easy. This is almost insulting. And then you go, oh no. Oh, yeah! I've made a rod for my own back here. Wait a minute, and that's and it's got that lovely feeling, and it's got some really interesting like targets that you're going for in the game. Sure. And I just think it's smart. Like I'm not roll and writes aren't my main category of game, but I really enjoyed that. And the game that I was going round the whole of UK Games Expo going, you've got to play this. They had 2 copies of it. This is my Deus Games, a kind of publisher who does lots of sort of Southeast Asian Chinese games.
All right, cool.
Jiraku I don't know. It's like a trick taker, 2 to 4 players, set just before the Warring States period in Japan. It's a trick taking game and an area control game over 3 rounds. It is sensationally good. So tight, so beautiful. I showed it to a few people. I said, do you want to just try this? It'll take under an hour to play. Everyone I played with immediately went, where can I get a copy? There was a scramble. My Day sold all their copies and someone ended up buying their display copy. It's a game that got stuffed because it came out during the pandemic and kind of missed its kind of slot in stores. It didn't really have a particularly, it didn't kind of come alive, and it was not a game made for Kickstarter. But my goodness, it's a hidden gem. Absolutely, just there's nothing brand new in it, but all the mechanics just slot together into this experience that everyone has. It's one of those games that people play 3 rounds, a couple of hands, and then they look up and go, I can tell this is going to be actually quite good. This is going to be quite good.
Let's just do that again.
People, sometimes going on their phone halfway through the game to see if they could get a copy. It's that much of where people start panicking slightly. What if I can't get hold of this? It's a real it's brilliant. So yeah, that was my game, even though it didn't come out.
Yeah,
then I'd seen it at Essen and they'd sold the copies there, but I think it's superb and a really underrated game. And I hope My Deus kind of feels this buzz that I'm trying to, be this kind of one-man army for it and do another reprint.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, like with Expo and with all conventions, it's so much about the experiences you get as well. Like, it's not necessarily the game that gets released there that you like buzz about. I have extremely fond memories of early, when it must have been like 2015, 2016 Expo, when they had a bar bus in the street food bit and sitting on top of it as the sunset with my friends, just playing Skull and having a beer or two. And that was just great. It was just wonderful, just sitting, chatting and relaxing and just, yeah. And it was just Skull. It's just, great.
I think, it's a lovely place for, we played, someone brought out a copy of a game called Festival of 1,000 Cats, which is like, it's another trick taker, about getting kind of like, but it's from a few years ago.
Oh,
so it's not a new game, but someone brought it to the table, and it was terrific. We were all like, how has this passed us by? And it's like, because it turns out that the kind of like buzz around games, and we're still, in a community that how games, the kind of word of mouth system is not infallible. And although some games have done like terrifically well through that, and really the word has got around, there are always ones that slip through the cracks. And that's what I find exciting, is that there'll always be people in the gaming halls just kind of going around almost sort of doing unpaid PR, almost being like missionaries with these unloved games. And they're often quite quick games. The reason that they end up being short ones is because those are the kind of things that you can get away with playing at a con. I mean, I got roped into a game of Terraforming Mars with all the expansions at one point, and it was a mistake. It was a mistake to step in, but I walked past and someone just went, "Are you Tim?" And I was like, yeah. Are you Tim Clare? And I was like, yeah. And they were like, do you want to play Terraforming Mars? And I was like, well, yeah, I do. I still have questions about how you know me and what's going on, but I stepped in and played it. And I love it, but it's not, it's in no way a good game to play if you want to get anything done. But I love that aspect of it. I love playing with people I wouldn't normally. I had lots of people introduce me to games I wouldn't have normally played, and some of them were like ones that are out of print. The kind of things you don't get to see in reviews as well, because, for obvious reasons, review channels don't tend to say, oh, here's a game that you can't get anymore that came out a long time ago and is unavailable. So if we say we like this, that's going to do you no good at all. You're going to be the ghost at the feast. You're going to be a small Victorian child kind of with your nose pressed to the window watching the family eat a kind of delicious Christmas roast dinner, but you won't be able to play. But people don't care about that at the con. They'll just go play this because I love it, and I really enjoy that.
Awesome. So I'd like to step away from the world of tabletop gaming for a little bit, because I first came across you through your writing course bootcamp, which I really enjoyed doing. Do you think that there are sort of like writing skills that translate to the world of sort of tabletop game design and criticism for yourself and myself that folk would find useful?
Yeah, I think there definitely are. I mean, there's some very, very obvious ones, and the most direct ones are to do with people who are writing. You know, I've had people on the show, I've interviewed tabletop role-playing game writers and designers, people like Grant Howitt. I spoke to Chris Farnell, who's written scenarios for Spire. I've spoken to people who've written, stuff for Pathfinder. I just had James L. Sutter actually on the show. Who
I listened to your one with Gareth Ryder Hanrahan as well.
Exactly. And he talked about some really, really interesting RPGs. Like the Dracula one they did.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of marginalia, and Dracula's conceived of as this kind of like document that you're picking apart to try and hunt down. It's like Dracula as a series of clues. So,
Dracula dossiers or something like that it's called.
Yeah. So there's those things where it's like that ability to capture people's imaginations. And there's lots of narrative-driven games where that ability to set a scene with a few words, or just, I think about what is a compelling and interesting story. Like games throughout history, and even the most abstract games, not the most abstract games, but most of games that even we think of as abstract have quite a great example is Santorini as a game that is an abstract and yet has done an amazing job of making itself feel thematic and taking all these kind of like gods and myths and then going, how would that exist within a game? But like, I think like fundamentally, in answer to your question, I thought we did years ago, we tried to join this French experimental literature group called the ULEPO, the Ouvroir de Literature Potentielle, kind of as a joke, right? They're like this famously obscure French group that sprung up in the 1960s and 70s that did all these like games with language, where they like a guy called Georges Perec wrote a novel called La Disparition, which after it had been released, people noticed that it didn't contain the letter E anywhere, and quite a lot of critics didn't notice when it first came out, and there was an angry backlash, like this is horribly pretentious. But it was actually he wrote several novels, including Life a User's Manual, which is an incredibly interesting novel, and they've got all these restrictions, these like, and often quite silly ones if you sort of describe them. But they're often really funny as well, and really interesting. And the ULEPO were interested in putting arbitrary restrictions on language to create poetry, to create stories, to create whatever, with this idea that it was a reaction against surrealism. And the idea was that surrealists were saying, we're going to make ourselves free by saying we can talk about anything, we can be really weird. And they were like, no, you're just falling into cliches and habits you don't realize you've got. One of the things about putting an arbitrary limit on something by giving yourself these restrictions that you don't need to face up to is that you'll force yourself out of your normal habits, and you'll start creating things you didn't expect. And I think that is where poetry and stories and games intersect. It's kind of like what Bernard Suits, who's a kind of games theorist from, I think he was writing in the 1970s originally, but he talked about games. His kind of summary of what a game is was that it's you set yourself some like unnecessary challenge that it doesn't have to be done, and then you kind of move through it. And I think that's the same as a story. That's the same as a poem. You know, we're setting ourselves arbitrary hoops to sort of jump through and dance through to force ourselves out of old habits and into, I mean, the things that we do round the table when we're given a board game. But it's like, okay, you've got to, you know, the simplest board game would be like, you've got to get your piece from one side to the other. But you can only move sideways. You can only move one space per turn. As soon as you start limiting powers, as soon as you start making it weird and difficult, that's where the game springs out of it. That's where ingenuity, that's why the kind of like most ridiculously elaborate role-playing game scenarios where the party come up with these like ludicrous schemes to get round some problem that are hilarious and creative. They exist because of those restrictions. And I think that's true of all games. You think of something like The Crew, right?
Yeah.
This game that has this fundamental restriction: if you don't talk, you've got something that you can signal with, but it's this cooperative card game where you can't talk. Now, if it didn't have that restriction, it would be a really boring game. But that restriction suddenly forces sometimes dramatic, sometimes just like really funny. Sometimes you just like, you smash the whole thing into a wall and it's really funny. And I think that's the same as writing a poem. You know, that's when you're not allowed, when you know, a limerick is such a stupid format to write. Like a haiku is like, why do we only use 575? And you've got to mention the season somewhere. There's got to be a season word in there.
Yeah.
Why? Well, because it's going to force you out of the obvious into these really, really interesting. It was Jay-Z in his book Decoded who came up with the best definition of poetry that I ever read, where I was so relieved when I read it. I was like, oh my gosh, we can go home. I can phone English departments up and down the land and go home, have a cup of tea and a chocolate hobnob. Because he just said a poem makes words work harder than they usually do.
Lovely.
And that's it, right? And I'm just like, yeah, that's great. And I think in the same way, I think games make human agency work harder than normally. Games make our brains work harder than they normally do. It's like you've got to get this boat from one side to the other, but I'm going to stick a load of crocodiles in the water. The other players playing the crocodiles. That becomes interesting in a way that just piloting a boat from one side of a river to the other isn't. So that's what I'd say all of it comes down to, is the fact that you're giving yourself some restriction. A novel's only interesting because we're going to follow this character, and I'm not going to tell all of human history. I'm just going to talk about them.
Yeah.
And I'm also they've got to go here. This character's just got to get a small piece of jewelry from their home to a mountain. But anyone holding it is going to start turning them evil and everyone wants to kill them.
That sounds terrible.
Right?
No one's ever going to read that.
Yeah, I know. It wouldn't work. It wouldn't work, right?
Fantastic. No, I love that. Oh, there's some great definitions in there. I love it, especially the Jay-Z one about poetry. Just fantastic.
It's brilliant, isn't it?
That's great. So you've done some reviewing for Tabletop Gaming Magazine, and your former editor, Chris, is in the audience. Hey, Chris. What do you think of the current state of board game criticism in the hobby?
So I feel myself kind of grinning because I want to say something sort of cheeky, but it would be a joke.
No, go ahead.
No, I don't, because I'm trying to I just kind of want to suddenly round and go, I've been keeping very quiet, but I don't feel like that at all. I mean, I feel that it is certainly, hopefully, a growth area that hasn't quite kind of come into its. I think we've gone through a kind of like golden era of board games. I think that is sort of so true that it seems like a cliche, but it sort of bears repeating that if you look at the whole human history of games, I feel like we are going through a period of unparalleled innovation and production of games, and people talking about game design as something that is a kind of like, almost like is a kind of calling, and you can be an auteur and a single person can design a game rather than games just being kind of folk games that get tweaked but are inherited.
Yeah.
We've never been through this period. So I think I'd be so, I'm so careful about not making silly ahistorical claims like that, but I just cannot think in the history of games much of which we actually don't know about because it's been erased because people didn't write them down because they didn't think they were important. But except when they were banning them, that's why like one of our earliest lists of games is the Buddha's list of games that monks shouldn't play, where they've got like clearly an early version of Pictionary, right? It's like you're dipping your finger into dye and then saying, what, and then people are going, what are you drawing? And it's like, oh, it's an elephant. Like we only know that those games were played because there was like suppression of them, right? But
wow,
we've never had anything like this before in terms of the number of people creating games and talking about how to make the best game and releasing and innovating. And I think we're in a kind of, we've been through a massive period of growth and of amazing games, and I'm just so thrilled to be part of it. But I'm not sure that our language for talking about games has caught up with that
I
yet.
agree with that. Yeah.
And that is not to in any way disparage people writing about it, because I think of myself as very, very much I think of myself as like very, very much like on the lowest rung of kind of learning about how to write about games and figuring out what I want to say and really sort of like looking up to my other peers around it for direction. So I'm not in any way don't mean it like that, but I just think we've yet to have like big. I've struggled to think of sort of big books that have come out that have been sort of defining books about how to think about games and how to play in the way that we have, E.M. Forster's aspects of the novel, those lectures, in the way that we have like the Lord Dunsany lectures about language, in the way that we've got some kind of like big theoretical books about literature, or people. Or big movements in movie criticism that have helped us frame and understand it. I think with games, we have lots of consumer reviews, and that's really cool, and it's really useful. And we've got a load of digital media that's doing really interesting things and lots of really great video. And
by consumer review, you mean the sort of like just like should you buy it, should you not kind of review?
Yeah, which is I think speaks to the fact. I mean, you don't get consumer reviews around poetry, and that's because there's a shrinkingly small consumer base. I think it's a sign that games are in a healthy state. Yeah, but there's just some people helping to sort of help people pick. I'm not disparaging that at all. You can definitely have poetry has gone through it's experienced a crisis of overproduction and underconsumption where loads of people want to write it. Very few people want to be purely readers, whereas board games are in a position where most people who consume them are in it because they want to play. And then there's some people who design who are probably players as well, but it's not like everybody who plays games. It really isn't that everybody who plays games wants to be a game designer. So we've got a very healthy mix of supply and demand, but I just would love to see. I'm gonna mention something that kind of Chris said in a talk, a panel that they did at UK Games Expo this year, where he's talking about the kind of like highest form of a board game review is the one where you kind of like get across the experience of what it was like to play the game. Not just the list of components, not just the mechanics, which I find all of that stuff super useful. If someone can say, like, it's kind of like, I described Jiraku to you, I immediately went to, it's a trick taker, it's got area control, it's kind of midway, it will play in under an hour. I gave you like the mechanics of it and the descriptors to help you place that. I use that all the time. Sure. But it's that ability to like figure out and start interrogating why we play games and also bring into this world of the hobby is a very tiny part of the overall player base of people who play card games and board games around the world. And I would love to see more joining up of that in a way that there used to be very hard walls between the simulationist war gamers and then people and then card players and family players. And I think those, that you can still make those distinctions, but I do think there's more transport between those worlds now. there's more games that have just been difficult to decipher which side they land on, right? Where they land right in the DMZ between two genres, and both groups kind of like go, what's this thing that's landed in between our two camps in this no man's land? And then they both meet each other at the table. I'd like to see more of that. So I would just like to see more of it. And I think in the way that with video game reviews, we've got a series of like really great video game essayists now on YouTube. People, there's too many to name, but I suppose like Jacob Geller is like a really great example of someone who makes really, and actually even in board games now, and we're starting to see like channels like Ristic Studies who do just mainly the focus is on like the art of Magic cards, like the artwork, but it will, he talks about very human incidents. He kind of like talks about kind of classical paintings, but also there's essays about like the values of cards in collectible card games and what it means to use physical cards that kind of get bent and tweaked and how we should relate to that, and sleeving cards. And it just gets very close to the heart of why we play. And I would just, I think that's what I'd like to see. And I sort of do feel Rising Up is that ability for us to sit down and kind of go, what, cool, like this game is brilliant. And you've said we need to come and play this. I love that. But I love stuff that reminds me or helps me understand why I'm sitting around my table playing with friends, because there's something very profound, I think, about playing games, not in a way to sort of valorize it or for us to get all hand-wringy because we need an alibi for doing something that historically has been seen as like not only frivolous but like used, like has been like actively legally suppressed and as seen as like this moral ill. I would love, I think when you choose to spend your parts of your life sitting around a table with friends, I think there's something kind of beautiful and profound about that. And it's okay to take that seriously. And we don't have to like come up with chin stroking justifications for it. But I would love to explore that because I think it's just as a legitimate part of our humanity as theatre, as literature. And I think it's just as a legitimate part of the arts, and I'd love to see more people exploring that because I find it fascinating.
Fascinating. I could also talk to you for hours about that kind of thing because I find it fascinating myself, the sort of like why we play. I mean, I've had the same I've had a gaming group on a Wednesday for, must be going on close to 2 decades now or thereabouts.
Wow.
Pretty much. And not quite the same group, but pretty close. Like there've been some changes here and there. Like people have like obviously left Edinburgh and gone elsewhere and people have come in. But yeah, pretty much been doing that on a Wednesday for, it must be close to 2 decades now. And just, and it's just that connection with friends around the table. It's great. But yeah, I agree. Like we should talk more about like why we play, like the sort of social aspects of play and that kind of thing as well as just the actual, the words we use to like talk about games and like that I think game criticism is still very young. We're still sort of trying, like you say, we're still trying to sort of find our feet as to how to talk about games properly and how to actually get into there and like sort of talk about why we play and why they're cool and like show other people why they're cool, because that grows the hobby and that's great. But let's take a break from that for a moment and let's talk about something else. I could go on and on about that for hours, but I will not. So one of the motivators for inviting you on the cast was your recent book about anxiety coming out in paperback. Can you tell us about your own relationship with anxiety and what drove you to write a book about your experience?
Yeah, so I mean, for years I sort of didn't really acknowledge that I was an anxious person, which is would be sort of seem ridiculous if even if you'd like known me, but also, from what I was, because I was having panic attacks every week and sometimes not just every day, but for multiple consecutive days, multiple times a day. And anyone who's sort of had a panic attack, it's, like I was, you're floored. I'd be completely in terror, just like pouring sweat, sometimes like screaming in terror, in fear. The incredibly irrational thing that when it's not going on, you think, why would I? That was weird. Like, I know not to be terrified when I'm in my own, when I'm in this room now, I know not to be terrified. And yet I was, and I was a worrier. I think sometimes when you say, I suffer from anxiety, people imagine you're sort of just a worrier. But actually, I was also really struggled with like deep anxiety and fear. And it would, and you think, well, I'm just going through a stressful period at work. Next week, it's going to change because I'll have got that thing out of the way, which I think everyone, you get to a certain point in adulthood and you realize the thing that you're sort of like, we're just going to get this next week out of the way and then it's going to be fine. Like that never comes, right? And I just realized that I wasn't coping. And then I became a dad. And it just kind of got to a head where I suppose, like, you have this big build up to this new person coming into your life. And so you've got a reason to feel anxious when that's happening. You go, well, of course I'm feeling anxious. But then it's happened and the anxiety hasn't gone away. And I was like, I've got to do something. And so I sort of decided that I was going to, and at the same time I was doing my podcast, right? And I'd been speaking to, I'd got interested in kind of like neuroscience and getting people on to talk about like the neuroscience of like literature. Like I got a neuroscientist on called Martin Lotzer, and I talked to him about him doing studies where they'd like put writers in fMRIs and they'd seen what parts of the brain were activated during creative writing process. And I was
amazing.
Like, and there's another guy that I spoke to who like did like the neuroscience of creativity and had done lots of studies on what part of the brains are and really, really interesting. I was just like, oh, these people are willing to talk to me. Maybe I could just sort of, if I was writing a book, it would sort of open a few doors to, which seems like a very sort of, I suppose it seems like maybe, I don't know if it sounds pragmatic or cynical, but I just thought if I tell people I'm writing a book, I think these academics will talk to me. And I thought maybe I've read all these articles about how we're just on this cusp of this new breakthrough in anxiety research. We're just on this breakthrough of like, this is the, scientists you'd read, especially if you're known to be anxious, lots of people will send you articles about things like saying there's going to be this new breakthrough. They think that they found the brain's fear center or whatever. And so I thought if I'm writing a book, it'll give me an excuse to like speak to loads of experts and then I'll just put into practice whatever they tell me and I'll work at it for a year. And I'll just go absolutely full out. This whole year, I will just try to beat my anxiety and do everything I can. And so that was the kind of genesis of the book really was, but I want to stress, like, it wasn't like a kind of a goofy quest.
No,
I was really clinging on by my fingertips. I think, like, in a way that you can't pitch the book to your publishers, going, "Look, guys, I'm actually mentally ill, and I need this to work." Like, they would be really worried. So you have to kind of be like, "Oh, I think this is a real there's a real public need for this." But obviously, like, my personal motivation was I wanted to not be suffering all the time, and I wanted to be able to get through a day. Like, I wanted to be able to feel like I could leave the house, which is like what this can feel like, when you're having panic attacks all the time. Feel like you can't drive, can't be in public. I mean, it's very debilitating. So that's how it sort of started. And then, I just went from there and started hammering out emails to people. I tell you what, don't mention this. Maybe I don't know if I mentioned this in the book, but like, it actually, one of the earliest things that happened was I was at Latitude Festival and UCL had like their neuroscience lab had like a stand in the middle of the woods. It wasn't even and I wandered up and I was like, do you have like an anxiety lab? And they were like, yeah. I was like, I want to write a book about it. And they were really sort of, I think they seemed a bit taken aback and weren't ready for this, but they gave me the email address of Dr. Oliver Robinson, who like runs their anxiety, who is like the most prominent neuroscientist studying anxiety in the UK. And then he just gave me his email address. And he said, yeah, sure, come to London and speak to me. And I did. And not only that, but I met someone else when I met Dr. Rohin Francis, who's a cardiologist, but a really great sort of medical YouTuber. On the same day, he was like, yeah, sure, I'll meet you. And like motorcycled over to meet me in a cafe. And I was like, oh my gosh, people are coming to see me. I've got to write the book now. Because you do feel like then you've snuck into, you do feel like you're going to be caught out. So yeah, that was it.
Fantastic. So in the process of writing that book, I've bought it. I haven't got around to reading it yet, but I do have a copy. But what actually sort of like, what did you find helped you the most over the course of that? Did you sort of settle on things for yourself? Because I know everyone finds their own way with this kind of stuff.
So, and the most common question I've been asked is, what helped you the most? And I want to sort of make it clear that I think it's this is going to sound like I'm dodging the question. I'm not, but like this is the nuance of it that I want to get to.
Sure.
It's like saying if it was cold outside, which is a really difficult thing to imagine at the moment, I know.
Yeah, I like it to be cold outside.
Yeah, and you kind of like put on kind of gloves, a scarf, a woolly hat, ear mufflers, and a coat. And then you went out and someone said, what of those things was the thing that kept you warm? The answer would come, I mean, I know this is a bad analogy because the answer would be probably, well, the coat mainly. But like, it'd be like, well, all of them actually contributed, right? And I think what we often do with these kind of like one thing cures is that we assume that we kind of like try one thing. We try putting gloves on, going out, we still feel cold. We come in, take the gloves off, put a woolly hat on, go out, we still feel cold. We come in, like, oh, the hat didn't work. And actually each of them are going to be nudging towards, in kind of genetics, actually was a way of thinking that Adam Rutherford, the geneticist, kind of nudged me towards, which is this idea in genetics that you don't have an anxiety, you don't have a gene for most complex traits. You don't have a one gene that is either switched on or off that makes you anxious or not anxious or whatever. But what you have is a kind of a polygenic liability threshold, which is like a whole bunch of genes, and each one just maybe nudges the probability of you being anxious forward by like 0.05% or something like that. So the answer is that like there's loads of little things, loads of tiny nudges that you can do that kind of maybe nudge you, but you can't escape being anxious. You can escape being, I think, pathologically, debilitatingly anxious all the time. When I haven't, at the time of recording, I haven't had a panic attack in, I want to say like 3 years, 9 months now.
Wow.
And I'd had them for over a decade, every week and most days and multiple times a day. So that's no small thing. But like, I'm still, I think, quite a highly strung individual, right? I can, I'm still like live in the world. I still like can look outside my window or look on the news or, have, relatives who are suffering or ill and face uncertainty. All of those things still exist. And I think as a human being, like you can't switch those off. But what you can do is do all these little things. So, I mean, another quick way of sort of answering what you're saying is like exercise helped a tiny bit, but actually the evidence for exercise is, the scientific evidence for exercise is really poor for beating clinical anxiety. Yeah, I was really surprised as well. I thought it was a slam dunk, but it's really, really
that seems like one of those things that people suggest so much when you're like for depression and anxiety, things like that. It's like, oh, have you been for a run recently, or words to that effect, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And what's interesting is if you look at I read sort of several meta-analyses which are take big loads of studies and they plonk them all together to study whether the effect holds over them. And the issue is, and there's been some great sort of papers written on this, that a lot of those studies are not on people with clinical anxiety. They just study whether people feel less stressed after going for runs or doing whatever. And these are not people who had clinical anxiety to begin with. They didn't have an anxiety disorder, but they'll report it as, going for a run 3 times a week reduces anxiety. Well, yeah, but it's in people who never asked for that benefit to begin with because they're a non-clinical, non-anxious population. And yeah, sort of it might make someone feel slightly less stressed in their daily life, but they weren't an anxiety sufferer. And secondly, you've got to think about the sampling bias in those kind of studies. They're voluntary studies. People know what's involved in them. People who do not enjoy exercise are unlikely to sign up for intensive 8-week trials where you have to run every day.
Yeah.
Like they just won't do it. So those studies are also very biased towards people who, are kind of more middle class, have got more time on their hands and tend to like exercise. So how well they translate to the general population is very tricky to say. And exercise raises cortisol, raises adrenaline, raises your output of stress hormones. So there's a whole kind of like question of what they call cortisol conscious training anyway, and how it affects anxiety and how it affects stress levels. So it's a really, really complex thing. And this is the problem is like people, including me, don't want to hear this. They want to hear like, do this. This is the one exercise you need to do. And you're going to smash anxiety. It will rewire your brain. It's going to release endorphins. It's going to release endorphins. You release, so what? So what are they going to release endorphins? What's an endorphin? People don't know. They know it's a neurotransmitter. Maybe it's going to release serotonin. Brilliant. What's serotonin? You can get serotonin in the serotonin stinging nettles. More serotonin doesn't mean anything. Like more serotonin does different things in different parts of the body. It will, if it's in your gut, it will give you diarrhea. It increases gut motility. Like having more serotonin doesn't mean anything at all. But people don't want to hear that. And sure. I didn't. And so I found myself getting very kind of shirty and frustrated actually with a lot of experts who seemed flaky to me because they would kind of go, well, it's complicated. And I go, well, you're supposed to be privately be thinking you're a researcher. Don't say that. I've watched TED Talks. They sound very confident in that 20 minutes. And it turns out that those people are saying things they would never say at a conference because their colleagues would laugh them off the stage. Like they're saying stuff to sell books and get grant funding. And you're like, oh, hang on. Oh, no. So, yeah, it's a really... And so I looked at all these different things. And I think there are things you can learn. It's like not the end of the world. I think it's more nuanced than that. And that kind of like approaching stuff with skepticism is actually often something that people with anxiety like me are quite bad at. We're actually not very skeptical about our predictions for the future, for example. And so I think there's something in the kind of scientific method that can also help with anxiety and worry.
Can we touch briefly on the title for the book? You called it Coward. What led to you calling it that?
I thought it, to be honest, I just thought it sounded kind of like provocative.
I mean, it is, which is why I kind of wanted to touch on it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I guess like it's just, it's this kind of the worst word that I can think of for people who are anxious.
Sure.
This idea, it's kind of wielded a lot in political discourse. As we call people cowards when they haven't done something that we want them to do. It's an ideological lever that we use to try and get people to do stuff that we want them to do that they have declined to do. And, that includes, being labelled a coward at times during history has been grounds for execution.
Yeah.
It's also quite like a gendered term, I think. Like it's rare that you hear women being called cowards. It tends to be sort of like something that's supposed to be an attack on someone's masculinity. And I think that's interesting as well, the way that culturally we've gendered emotions so that for men it's sort of shameful to show fear and for women it's shameful to show anger. In this kind of broad stereotypical way, we see those things as sort of slightly unseemly. And I think that is, I think there's few people, if you kind of like speak to them off the clock at the bar, who wouldn't concede that is extremely unhelpful, unhealthy and toxic for everyone involved in that. to say that either that anyone just like shouldn't have access to like a major human emotion or shouldn't show it is just a recipe for being really not super well. So I think it was just a way of kind of confronting that head on, not anything sort of so grand as like reclaiming the word or anything like that. Although I am quite fond of it because it means an animal with its tail between its legs. When you talk about like heraldry, a kind of lion coward is a lion where the tail is kind of flicking back and going underneath its legs. You have like lion rampant and lion courant and things like that. And a lion coward is when it's got its tail between its legs. And so it's supposed to evoke a kind of animal in retreat or something like that. That's the idea. It's also this idea that that people are kind of reverting to their kind of animal nature and there's something lesser about them when they become a coward. And I kind of just wanted to, I think a kind of dog with its tail between its legs is quite to me at least, quite a sympathetic, a sympathetic picture rather than something that would arouse my contempt. And there's definitely this idea of cowardice as well. Has been something that's been a real tool of empire to kind of shame people, and I don't like that. And I just think you can take the power away from a lot of these words by using them and not flinching from them.
Fantastic. Yeah, I agree. So how has tabletop gaming helped or exacerbated the anxiety you experience?
Writing the book I'm working on at the moment, it's really struck me that behind all the games that I sort of speak to people about and play with people, I've had to done loads of interviews and gone out to meet people to play games. So often we've had to like delay something because they'll explain, I'll get this glimpse into somebody's life and something really serious going on. Someone's been hospitalized.
Yeah.
They've been bereaved. And it's just really struck me, I think especially with the coming out of the pandemic and things like that, how often, seemingly sort of tiny things like, game nights and stuff are often taking place around kind of big human drama. And I think that they've provided for me a kind of place of stability and a place of safety and a place of retreat. And I think people often think of that as being of a piece with something that's infantilizing and it's kind of escapist in this pejorative sense. But I don't mean it like that.
No.
If people don't understand why anyone would benefit from escapism, I suggest, have you seen, gestures at the world, right? Like,
look outside.
Yeah. Exactly. And we're kind of expected to kind of consume news and consume media in this way that there's to kind of consume horrifying news all the time is a kind of moral act to bear witness. And I think it's important sometimes to rest, and it's important sometimes to engage in this, what's been called by sociolinguists like phatic communion, this thing of like just being around other human beings and being part of a social group and working on something together, whether it's, because any game is a cooperative act as well. Even when you're playing diplomacy, it's a cooperative act, right? Like the game is based on certain understandings of I'm this country, you're that country. These are the rules of the game, right? That game, for all its cutthroatness, is a consensual, cooperative exercise in very high risk theatre, right? Like and I love that about games, that even ones that aren't co-ops are co-ops, and it's really interesting how people will, try to mitigate things. There's all sorts of. I love the sociology and politics of dealing with a table and dealing with people's feelings if you're, attacking them or whatever. And I love that so much. I love cultures of kind of trash talk, because that requires immense trust and safety.
Yeah, absolutely.
Trash talk to actually be fun and actually be pleasurable. It's one of my favorite things, but you can only do it when you know you're safe, when you know, otherwise you're just being a meanie, right? Otherwise you're just like, anyone can just be rude or unkind or arrogant. That isn't trash talk to me. That's just being horrible, a horrible human being. There's something really funny to the point where I'll have tears rolling down my eyes when someone's good at trash talk around the table. When you're playing a game with hidden roles and someone's sneaky and then they're revealed and you were a minion of Mordred all along in Avalon. That's really funny to me. And these things are a great source of, been a great refuge for me. And I think every human being needs multiple refuges. And like, even if they're just neutral places, even if they're, what they've sometimes called in psychiatry, company without intimacy, this idea of having safe places where people who do not, they almost feel like, especially if, people are having real, like, major psychiatric problems, feel even just kind of opening up to someone is threatening and they start losing their sense of self. But you can sit at a chessboard and play a game with someone and not talk. And you can have company without intimacy. Even when it's kind of like games are a bit boring. When people say, when I describe to someone who doesn't play games what Power Grid is, and I'm like, gather round, and who can develop the most efficient energy infrastructure in Western Germany? And it's like, I love that game. It's incredibly fun. But if someone said to me it's boring, I'd say that's the point. That's deeply comforting to me.
Yeah.
Do you know what isn't boring? Like the news. Do you know what isn't boring? Like being a human on this rock in this body made out of meat that won't last forever. Like if you think about our own existences, like they are hugely dramatic at every moment, pregnant with meaning all the time. And a game is just like a way to kind of it gives you the option to step out of that for a few hours. And I think that is a perfectly sane and reasonable thing to want to do. And in doing that, I think it can replenish you. So I found it hugely restorative to play games, like hugely restorative. And sometimes it's been, my worst times in my life, going to my weekly D&D group and getting to do something of no consequence, except in the ludic space of that game, has been the most restorative and safe and nourishing thing. And I think that's kind of a beautiful thing. And it's why I'm really, really, as the years have got on, cared more and more passionately, without admittedly doing anything concrete about it, in terms of making sure that the hobby space and the gaming world is welcoming to everyone who wants to play and open to as many people as possible, because I just know how much it's meant to me. And what an incredible space it can be for people getting together and just being allowed to be and feeling safe in a way that can kind of, like, I think, spiral out into so many aspects of your life. And I know it does because I've spoken to so many people for what I'm working on. And, they've often talked so movingly about how it's allowed them to experience a different side of themselves that they wouldn't have known that then just resonates out and makes better every other part of their life. So, yeah, I think it's been, and I would be the first person to, complicate it and go, oh, games can be, terrible and have been terrible for my anxiety. If they had, I'm sort of fastidious to a point of being tedious and boring about complicating things and problematizing them and kind of not making an easy narrative out of it. But I do feel kind of evangelical about games and the gaming space as being something that has persisted throughout all human history and predates the the invention of an alphabet. There's a reason that it's survived and that it's been so primal to all civilization. And I think that's why we have to like make sure that everyone feels that they have a right to participate.
Yeah, I agree entirely. I mean, it's been a place of refuge for myself. I mean, my dad is quite ill at the start of the year. I was going down there. My parents are in the Highlands, so I was going down there and helping them out. And yeah, just having the sort of the Wednesday group, even if it was online, to do something was just great. Just a moment to like forget that stuff's going on for a little bit and just take a moment to breathe and just have a bit of moment to yourself. I agree entirely. Games can be, a refuge, if you want to call it that, but in a good way, not in a pejorative way. Just like, it's nice to take a step away from your life for a little bit and forget that exists and go and be Greek heroes or Dungeoneers or whatever. It's great. So you had, before we get onto the book you've alluded to a couple of times, so I do want to talk about that. You had a late in life diagnosis of autism. What was it like to receive that diagnosis, and do you think it's affected your relationship with tabletop gaming?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't have got it if I wasn't working on this book about tabletop gaming. I would never have gone for it because I was sort of conscious that in my experience of playing games, I'd encountered what felt like maybe, a significant number of people who were on the spectrum or were neurodivergent. And I wanted to write about that because I felt there was probably like some connection, or there was something that made games a useful technology for people who are, autistic or ADHD or any kind of like neurodivergence. I thought, maybe there's something there. So the first thing I did was I put out a call and said, are you neurodivergent? Do you play games? Would you be willing to talk to me? I'd really love to speak to some indie gamers and just like get your thoughts and what draws you to games. Mm-hmm. And I had some really lovely conversations, and it was like super great and really interesting. And I was really sort of challenged a lot of my assumptions, right? Because people, speaking to someone who's autistic and their favorite games are like role-playing games and, like games like Code Names and things like that and hidden. And I was like, but these are like so very social games.
Social, yeah.
Like, don't autistic people like, I mean, I think I hopefully phrased it sort of slightly more delicately than this, but don't like autistic people like mathematical games? Isn't that the stereotype, right? Isn't it like about wanting to have systems and that you could slot together? And it's like, no, because like in a game like, say, Code Names or a game with hidden roles and bluffing, which you might, naively think would be like the worst thing. It's like, you get to practice like watching someone's face and seeing if there's any difference when someone's lying, seeing when someone's being sarcastic. You get to practice emotions. And you get to repeat that cycle over and over again, and it's explicitly gamified, and you get a clear win or loss condition. Yeah. No, I was joking. And Codename, someone's making an inference. They're like going, here's an implication I want you to draw out of a clue. And then you get to practice it. Was I right? Was I wrong? I get points for knowing how well did I read someone's intent. How well did I read someone's mind? This kind of like failure of empathy and modeling of a neurotypical mind is, I've spoken to like a researcher in autism who talked about the different ways at a kind of like population level that neurodivergent and neurotypical people will play games like the kind of Prisoner's Dilemma style classic games, and their ability to model what other people are going to do is different. And they were like, you get to practice. I was like, okay, this is making sense.
Fascinating.
Well, I felt like I should. So here's what I thought. I knew I was a nerd, right? And happily a nerd. I've kind of come to like that part of myself after years of sort of trying to hide it and trying to be very kind of laddish in a way that was never convincing to anyone at all. I thought, but there's a difference between being a nerd and being autistic. Right, there's a difference between like liking, watching Star Trek, which I did, and liking Super Mario a lot, which I didn't do, and playing board games, which but I was like, there's a difference between that and being actually autistic. But what I'll do is I'll go and get a an assessment.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'll be able to talk about what games do connecting autistic people and neurodivergent people. The inside, but also I'll have very clearly gone, and this is why I'm not, right? This is what the difference between, because otherwise people, because very sort of frivolously, I guess, people might go, well, surely all gamers are kind of a bit autistic, right? You want to go and sit in a shed and push around little plastic minis. Isn't that just autism? And it's like, that's one stereotype of autism. And the other is, well, no, none of them are autistic because autistic people can't speak. And so these are the kind of two extremes. I thought, well, I'll go and I had to fill in all these forms, and I did 2 full days of assessment, one with a speech and language therapist, one with a psychologist. So, it wasn't like a 1-hour online thing. It was like a full on. And I thought, well, this is going to sort of sort it out. And then they'll tell me no. And I'll get a report and I'll understand why. And I'll be able to talk about it, I think, in a way that is respectful, because any autistic person will see, I know what it's like to go through that assessment process. I've spoken to lots of autistic people. I'm not just coming in and saying something glibly from the outside. And then they go 2 weeks later, and this was done, the sort of debrief was done over Zoom. And the psychologist, they'd had their conflab, they'd written their report, and she said, you are the most fantastically autistic person I've ever assessed. She said, I'm shocked that it hadn't been caught up until now.
Wow.
I don't know how you've got this far without someone picking it up. It must have been, and I just broke down crying. And then then the psychologist started tearing up as well. And she's like, and walked me through some of the stuff. And then to be honest, I was a little bit in denial. I was like, well, because here's the thing, right, Ian, here's the thing that I feel a bit ashamed of in retrospect. But actually a lot of people, when I read a couple of people saying that they were autistic or had got late autism diagnoses, I'd read their testimony and I'd go, well, you're just describing being a person. This is stupid. I'd be going, that's not real. Okay, because you're just describing being a human. Everyone feels that way. So autism isn't a thing, or at least this version of it, what we used to call Asperger's. And I think that is genuinely confusing for people, that this is kind of like, we used to call some of these things, and then it's called high functioning autism and things like that. Clearly there is a difference between this and, autistic people with additional needs, non-verbal autistic people, autistic people who've got maybe some kind of intellectual capacity issues alongside their autism as well. Those things are kind of comorbid, but are not both autism. They just frequently happen together. I found it but I was really skeptical of various people who said that they were autistic for a while, because everything they described was what I'd been through. And I was just like, well, you're just describing what everyone feels. So, and of course, now I didn't realize that their dramatic irony was was around the corner, laughing his head off. Because I was just like, what? This is nonsense. You're just describing being a person.
Yeah, everyone feels like this, don't they?
Yeah, exactly. And then in retrospect, it's like, I think there's always a danger of over-determining one's identity purely through a neurodivergent lens and so making everything. You do get, of course, because the internet being the internet, you do get some people going, "Cool, I sure like pizza." Typical autistic person, and you're just like, no, that's just people like everyone likes pizza. That's actually nothing to do with it. It's very difficult for people to go, cool, or when people are talking about ADHD, to a certain extent, procrastination is a universal human issue. It's not in and of itself ADHD. Now, the difficulty is some people in communities are joking. They'll talk about a symptom and they'll go, cool, I've just, all my clothes are on the floor drobe, but all my socks are in color coded and are hung up in and they're all on pegs, hashtag ADHD, and they're joking, but they're not, and that person does have a diagnosis. And it's tricky because from the outside it can seem like frivolous and these are kind of in-group things. So I want to be clear that sometimes the way that communities talk, they're not always talking for an as like they're not always doing outreach when people talk amongst themselves about stuff. And the same with autism
within the community.
Exactly. And sometimes I'll talk about aspects of autism and I'll kind of wave my lanyard in a way that I am, I feel a bit guilty, but sometimes I am sort of joking and sometimes I'm not. I went to the Super Mario Brothers movie with my 6-year-old daughter, and Super Mario Brothers has been my special interest since I was in the first year of primary school. Genuine, it's been my autistic special interest. I was drawing Mario pictures before I could write proper words, and it is now. And I wept multiple times during that movie. And on one hand, that is really funny to me. I can see that it is funny that a 42-year-old man crying with emotion at a Super Mario Brothers movie that in no way tries to evoke those emotions. Like, that's not. It's supposed to be a light romp, an adventure. Right? I understand that, but it was the first time in my life where everyone was just like psyched to see Mario. They'd done a good job of it after years of it not being good. And I was there with my daughter. That was very meaningful to me. And I was like really badly bullied at school because I liked Mario, and then I continued to like Mario as I became a teenager, as it became sort of increasingly less appropriate for me to be wearing like a Mario full Mario matching tracksuit with like a Mario t-shirt, a Mario wallet. And I was like, you're 15 and 16 and people are starting to sneak into pubs and they're smoking. They're thinking about getting their first car. And I'm still like watching Mario cartoons and writing Mario fan fiction. And like I hadn't aged up with anyone else. And you develop a lot of shame around those things.
Sure.
And to just go and enjoy something. So that, that is simultaneously a joke, right? Because I know it's funny. And I know Mario is not a serious piece of media. But my joy of watching that film and the amount of fun I had watching it, something that I think is probably like only an all right movie, actually. I think it's probably as good as, say, like Trolls World Tour or something like that. It's like at that level, it's like a competent piece of like animation, but it's not amazing or transcendent, but it meant so much to me. And I think that's the upside of autism, right? As well, that's one of the kind of bits that make people talk about it. It's like not just a disability, but a superpower. It's that like nobody who watched that movie had as good a time as me. I wrung every penny's worth of value out of watching that. It was like a religious experience for me. And I think that capacity to feel joy at not terribly good things, right? That just make me really happy. I think is one of the sort of wonderful upsides, really, just to be super enthusiastic about stuff. And I think one of the things I've had to unlearn to be happier is to not apologize for that and take it seriously. Yeah. I don't have to go, I'm not like stopping people at kind of like grown up barbecues and saying, no, you're wrong. This is why Mario is actually great art. But I also just go, look, I'm autistic and I love Super Mario. And I think almost everyone is actually not in any way bothered by that. Like no one is scandalized. No one is really looking down at me. Nobody cares. And then you're like, cool, we can just enjoy stuff now. And I think actually most people are pretty cool with that. And like learning that life isn't being a teenager at school, you can, I think it's true, but this is true for everyone, right? To just like love your enthusiasms unapologetically and take it seriously.
Yeah. Amazing. So before we wrap up, I'd just like to chat about the book you're working on right now. I know it's about tabletop gaming, but I don't know much else. Can you tell us a little bit about sort of what it's about, what the focus is?
Yeah, so we haven't got a title yet. I've been kind of knocking, and they all either sound really cheesy or like horribly academic, like really chin strokey. And so I'm trying to find something that's good and not just dreadful. But it's about tabletop games and how they bring people together. That's it. That's the remit. But it's taking a kind of whistle-stop tour through all of world history and all around the world in contemporary games. And like, I don't write about any games that I haven't sat down and played. So it's kind of like a mix of, I started playing I'd never touched Magic the Gathering before I started writing the book. And
all right,
I picked that up for the first time. And I think playing that game is one of the reasons I ended up getting an autism diagnosis, because it's very clear the like level of me playing that and the level of kind of like diving into that game that I went into, that I knew was in me, because I knew when I played Netrunner, which I think is the superior game. It's Netrunner is like superb, and I think the way it's being looked after now and the card design now is brilliant. I think is it like Nisei or who are like looking after it?
Project Nisei,
just knocking it out of the park. I could not be. I think their attitude to it, I think the way that they talk to the community, but also just the card design and the card pool is exemplary. It's really good.
I've only played the Gateway stuff at Tabletop Scotland last year, but they're going to be at Tabletop Scotland this year, the Project Nisei folk. So I will probably buy, everything, because I won't be able to.
Yeah, it's really good. It's been consistently good. They've been really careful about not over-releasing. Everything's like balanced, but not balanced within an inch of its life, so it's still fun. Yeah. There's callbacks to old cards. It's just done so well. And I think it particularly just has a big contrast with like the state of the game towards the end of its life, with FFG just going through a lot of designers, all of whom I really admire, actually. Like, I think everyone who kind of had to, but I think that a lot of people who were put in lead design positions were just put in an impossible position as well. Yeah. Too much was released, and now it's in a brilliant place. So it's about me. It's kind of like a stupidly impossible remit, because I'm trying to sum up all of games and why we play games. You know what we talked about at the beginning? Yeah. It's going to sound like, I don't mean to say like I was going, oh gosh, well, I realise now it sounds like I've gone, games journalism needs to, and how we write about games really needs to mature and come into itself. And what that would be is someone talking about why we play games. And then I've gone to the end and I've gone, I'm writing a book on this exact subject. And it's like I've crowned myself. I don't mean it like that. Obviously, we end up writing towards what we aspire to or like, or what we see there being a lack of. I'm not sure. I feel like it's going to be an interesting failure, the book. It can't possibly hit all the notes that I'm trying to hit, but I want to just like work out why tabletop games are just persisting and going from strength to strength. I mean, of course, we're going through like a tricky like financial period, but I also don't think that the health of the scene can be measured in economic events. That is something that for a lot of the smaller publishers who I care about hugely, I can understand why it's going to be really difficult for them. But I don't for a second think that reflects how much people are playing, because it doesn't in terms of who's at the cons. It doesn't, like, everyone, when I go to my local game like nights and stuff, they're rammed and people have got loads of games, but they're not necessarily brand new games. You know, they're games that people are bringing from the last 5-10 years. So yeah, I want to talk about why people play, and I'm not going to like, I've sort of my publisher was quite keen that I was sort of going to explain why we should play games and the benefits, the psychological benefits and things like that. And there is some of that, but I also don't want to fall into that kind of classic crouched defensive posture of saying, here's why games are actually really grown up. Because you get that even like games, yeah, exactly. And you make a mistake when you do that, when you accept this kind of productivity narrative that fun isn't enough, that joy isn't enough, that companionship isn't enough, that humans being I mean, because you know this, right? You've walked through aircon. They see people around the table just like thumping the table, howling with laughter. And you go, you know, imagine seeing that and then going, yes, but how can we justify this? It's like completely, it's like saying, it's so silly. And I think it fundamentally misses the point. And I think we can talk about that, but it almost is kind of like hand wringing, and it's almost like saying that the way that children's toys get advertised now as they're like helps with healthy development, this kind of neuro nonsense that gets thrown and stuff that is meant to play into parents' anxieties about their children becoming kind of like productive, and it's going to help your child's brain grow. Yeah, because there's been this rash of children's brains not developing unless they get a particular Fisher-Price toy. You know, that's what we've known is these. It's nonsense, but it plays into this thing. But they never go, your child's going to have a hoot with this. It's really, just imagine if there was a kid's toy advertised on TV and it went, it's really fun. It's really fun. It'll make them laugh. It makes funny noises. They'll laugh. They never say that. They always go, well, helps develop numeracy. I don't care. Like, what? Who cares? So for me, it's about like getting back to basics, really, and getting back to this kind of fundamental about the magic and the fundamental unpin-downableness of what's happening in a game. You know, and I talk about very serious stuff. I've interviewed people I interviewed a guy in Kiev who is on the sort of night watch, shooting down Russian drones every night. Who is also, because there's like long periods where nothing's happening. Just it's like it's one of those jobs like air traffic control where there's like long periods of tedium punctuated by like 5 minutes of like sheer white knuckle terror. But he set up a webcam, and his son and his wife are in the Netherlands. They're refugees there, and they both got a copy of Blood Bowl. And they play, and he's like Skavens, I think, and they're playing like big leagues in the time with it set up with 2 separate boards.
That's amazing.
And in the middle of a war zone, with like limited internet and electricity, he's using, and with like quite a lot of operational secrecy as well, right? He's using that to maintain a connection with his son. And so, it's frivolous, but
wonderful.
It's also literally a lifeline.
Yeah,
like it's also literally a lifeline, and I think we can be deadly serious about fun. And so that's what the game is. It's not like I'm not going to be doing this, writing this book, going, and this is why it's okay to play games, and we don't have to be ashamed, because I don't feel like anyone who wants that argument from me, I'm willing to give it to them, but I do want to like set out my stall for the incredible world of games, in the hope that whether people play games or not, they can come to them with this kind of greater dimension of enjoyment and appreciation. Whether you never play a game again, but whenever you pass someone playing in the park or whatever, you go, oh wow, and you understand a bit more about what they might be doing. Or whether you play games and you suddenly feel connected to this incredible lineage that just shoots through every civilization in human history in a way that has blown my mind researching the book.
Fantastic. I mean, I could talk to you for literally hours about this stuff, Tim. I really could, because you speak incredibly well on it, and it's just fascinating stuff. We've got one member of the audience left, given Tessie, who was you demoed Draco to them at Games Expo, apparently, to Ava and themselves as well.
Oh, yeah.
Got any questions, given Tessie, for Tim before we wrap up? Given Tessie says, just admit that Monikers was the best thing you played at UK Games Expo.
Okay, so we played a game of Monikers at UK Games Expo, 8 of us, and I would like to just, if I can, just touch on Monikers.
Sure.
Because it's a game that for people who haven't played it, it's sometimes known as the hat game. Shut Up and Sit Down have done a great video on it, talking about it, but it's a game where people write down words or things or phrases. They could be anything from a smooth dog to robot Robert De Niro to the Christmas. You know, it can be anything, a phrase, a small, and it goes into this hat, and then people take them out one by one, and you start off having to do a kind of taboo style party game where you're allowed to describe the thing using any words but the words on the piece of paper. and you've got a minute, and you've got to rush through them and do as many as possible. So you do that, and then there's a second round where they all go. Any ones that people don't get put back into the hat, and then it will sort of slowly move round your group, and you're working in two teams. So eventually, ones that were too obscure and difficult to get, everyone in the team or some members of the team will have seen before when they were trying to do the charade bit. So they'll go, oh, you're talking about this one that I've seen before that was completely stupid, and they'll guess it and you'll score that one. Second round, they all go back in the hat, and this time you can only use one word to allude to the thing. But now everyone's familiar with most of the things that are in there, so it's a little bit easy. That feat can be done. And then in the last round, I want to say you can't speak. You can mime, maybe. You're just doing actions, right? And it creates the reason why, like, games. I want to avoid talking about this specific game that we played that lasted about 2 hours. Is because it is like going on a long car journey where you just develop a series of in-jokes, which are how you allude to the different clues, right? But what's interesting about it is you actually develop your own in-group language where someone will have tried to talk about this one. There was, one of the pieces of paper was the difference between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans or something like that, right? It's not inherently funny, but it's really difficult to explain to a group in a way that they'll get it. But eventually everyone's seen that bit of paper and someone guesses it. And then you've got to go to it. You've got to say about it with one word. But how do you mime the difference between the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans as a phrase? Well, if everyone knows it, someone will start making a sort of splashing thing and flailing around. And then someone will just shout the difference between the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. What's fascinating about the game is if someone's not been there from the beginning, to the casual observer, that looks like you're doing the impossible, because someone just flails and someone says the very specific phrase, the difference between the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans, and you go, yes. And
they're like, are you psychic?
Exactly. And you've created this, what was talked about by a linguist called Bernstein. He talked about open and restricted codes in different social groups. And what you've done, and he talked about open codes being very intelligible by everyone, and they tend to be used by middle class speakers, and you can go through different contexts, and they're very specific and they're very explicit and they explain everything in very articulate, long ways. But the thing about restricted codes is they often use a lot of slang, a lot of compressed, a lot of nuance, a lot of implication, not very many words, a lot of technical language. But in that in-group, you can express huge amounts in 1 or 2 words. And what you do in that game is create an incredibly dense and incredibly rapid in-group restricted code that allows you to talk to people that I didn't know most of the people around that table. And I was able to communicate with them and understand them, with like a grunt or just like they would, or just something, someone would just do some kind of gesture and I would say that. And I think that it's an astonishing game for kind of group bonding. And it's some people's idea of a complete nightmare. Because it's one of those kind of like organized humiliation games that feels like a kind of worst work away day thing. I was not up for playing it. I'll be honest. I didn't want to play it. I thought I'd hate it. I nearly did myself a mischief laughing. And that brings me back actually to your first question about UK Games Expo and why going to these cons can be useful. Yeah, because often it actually challenges my sense of what I know and what I do or don't like. Because you start, playing a lot of games and doing a lot of game criticism. You imagine you can spot these things coming from a distance. Yeah. And you start to think of yourself as an expert in a way that can make you very close-minded, or makes me very close-minded. And it's really good to be reminded I actually know very little. And I go, oh, this is great. And I'm so glad I got press ganked into playing this.
Yeah, it's always nice to be surprised by a game as a critic, because you're just like, oh, I'm not going to like this. Then you play it and you're like, actually, this is pretty good. It's great.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
I love it when that happens. So you're just like, this is great. I'm glad I played it. Right, I think we'll have to bring that to a close, Tim, because we've been chatting for a while. I could go on for hours with you. I really could. You're a fascinating person to talk to, and you know an awful lot about your subjects. I would love to talk to you more about it. I really would. But there's only so much can fit in the cast. Where can our listeners find you? Where's the best place to find you online?
Well, there's two places really. You can find me on Twitter at Tim Clare Poet is my handle there, and that's where I do sort of most of my howling into the void. I've also got a podcast. It's mainly about writing and books and stories and the people who make them. It's called Death of a Thousand Cuts. And you can just find that by searching for Death of a Thousand Cuts or Tim Clare or Death of a Thousand Cuts podcast. There's loads of episodes, interviews with all sorts of writers in different genres. And as you said, there's a couple of free writing courses and me just talking about writing. So those are the two places.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Tim. Really, really appreciate your time. And yeah, fascinating chat. Loved it. Loved it to bits.
Thank you ever so much for having me, Ian.
No problem at all.